Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The May moon was bright in the sky. The parks were green with new leaves. People came from the west and south to buy things. Flowers were blooming, and people selling summer trips were busy. The air felt softer, and people spoke more kindly. Everywhere, there were hand organs playing music, fountains flowing, and people playing cards. The windows of Mrs. Murphy's boarding house were open. Some of the boarders sat on the front steps. They sat on round mats that looked like big pancakes. In one of the front windows on the second floor, Mrs. McCaskey was waiting for her husband. The dinner on the table was getting cold. This made her angry. At 9 o'clock, Mr. McCaskey came home. He had his coat on his arm and his pipe in his mouth. He said sorry to the people sitting on the steps as he walked carefully past them. He tried not to step on anyone. When he opened the door to his room, he was surprised. Usually, his wife threw things like stove lids or potato mashers at him. But tonight, she only used words. Mr. McCaskey thought the nice May moon had made his wife kinder. "I heard you," said Mrs. McCaskey. "You say sorry to strangers for stepping on their dresses, but you don't care about your wife. I wait for you so long that my neck gets tired from looking out the window. The food is cold because you spend all your money drinking at Gallagher's every Saturday night. The gas man came twice today because we can't pay the bill." "Woman," said Mr. McCaskey, throwing his coat and hat onto a chair. "Your loud voice is ruining my appetite. You talk about manners, but you have none. I was only being polite when I asked those ladies to move so I could pass. Now stop talking and bring your face away from the window. Go look after the food." Mrs. McCaskey got up slowly and went to the stove. Her face showed anger. Mr. McCaskey knew this look. When her mouth turned down like that, something bad usually happened, like dishes or pots flying across the room, shouted Mrs. McCaskey. She picked up a pan full of bacon and turnips and threw it at him. But Mr. McCaskey was quick. He knew how to fight back. On the table, there was a roast with decorations. He threw it at her. Mrs. McCaskey answered by throwing a bread pudding. Then Mr. McCaskey threw a piece of cheese that hit her under the eye. She fought back with a coffee pot full of hot coffee. This should have ended the fight, but Mr. McCaskey wasn't finished. He picked up a big wash basin and threw it at her. Mrs. McCaskey dodged it just in time. Then she grabbed a flat iron to throw at him. But before she could throw it, a loud scream came from downstairs. Both of them stopped and listened. Policeman Cleary stood on the sidewalk near the house. He listened to the sound of pots and pans crashing inside. "It's John McCaskey and his wife fighting again," he thought. "Should I go upstairs and stop them? No, I won't. They're husband and wife, and they don't have many joys in life. The fight won't last long. They'll run out of dishes to throw soon." Just then, a loud scream came from downstairs. It sounded scared or very serious. "It's probably just the cat," said Policeman Cleary. He quickly walked away. The people sitting on the steps got worried. "Mr. Toomey, who sold insurance and liked to investigate things, went inside to check. When he came back, he said, "Mrs. Murphy's little boy, Mike, is lost." Right after him, Mrs. Murphy came outside. She was crying loudly and waving her hands in the air. Mrs. Murphy was a big woman, 200 pounds of tears and worry. She was crying over her little boy, Mike, who was full of freckles and always causing mischief. It was a sad moment, but Mr. Toomey sat down next to Miss Purdy, who worked in a hat shop. Their hands met in sympathy. The two old sisters, Mrs. Walsh, who always complained about the noise, asked, "Did anyone check behind the clock?" Major Griggs, who was sitting next to his large wife on the top step, stood up and buttoned his coat. "The little boy is lost?" he asked. "I will search the city for him." His wife usually didn't let him go out after dark. But now, she said in a deep voice, "Go, Ludovic." Who could see a mother's sadness and not want to help? Only someone with a heart of stone. "Give me 30 or maybe 60 cents, my love," said the major. "Lost children sometimes go far. I might need car fare." Old Mr. Denny, who lived in a small room on the 4th floor, was sitting on the lowest step. He was reading a newspaper under the streetlight. He turned the page to keep reading about a carpenter's strike while Mrs. Murphy cried to the moon, "Oh, Mike, for heaven's sake, where is my little boy?" she shouted. "When did you see him last?" asked Mr. Denny. He kept one eye on the newspaper. "Oh," cried Mrs. Murphy, "was it yesterday? Or maybe 4 hours ago?" "I don't know. My little boy Mike is lost. He was playing on the sidewalk this morning. Or was it Wednesday? I'm so busy with work, it's hard to remember. I've searched the whole house from top to bottom, and he's gone. Oh, please help me. The city is big, cold, and uncaring to many people. They say it has no heart and no pity. But sometimes, under the hard surface, there is kindness and care. People may compare the city to a tough lobster shell, but inside, there is something soft and good. When a child is lost, everyone feels it deeply. Little children have small, unsure feet, and the world is a big, strange place for them. Major Griggs walked quickly to the corner and then up the street to Billy's bar. "Give me a rye whiskey," he told the bartender. Then he asked, "Have you seen a little boy?" About 6 years old, dirty-faced, bow-legged, and always up to no good. Mr. Toomey still held Miss Purdy's hand as they sat on the steps. "Think about that poor little boy," said Miss Purdy. "He's lost, far from his mother. Maybe he's already been hurt by a horse running in the streets. Oh, isn't it terrible?" "You're so right," said Mr. Toomey, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Maybe I should go help look for him." "Maybe you should," said Miss Purdy. "But, oh, Mr. Toomey, you're so brave and bold. What if something bad happens to you while you're looking? Then what would I do?" Old Mr. Denny kept reading his newspaper, using his finger to follow the lines. On the 2nd floor, Mr. and Mrs. McCaskey came to the window. They needed to rest after their fight. Mr. McCaskey was using his finger to clean turnip pieces off his vest, and Mrs. McCaskey wiped her eye, which still hurt from the salt in the roast. They heard the commotion below and looked out the window. "Little Mike is lost," said Mrs. McCaskey quietly. "The sweet little troublemaker." "The boy is missing," said Mr. McCaskey, leaning out the window. "That's bad. Children are different, you know. If it were a woman who got lost, I wouldn't mind so much. At least it would be peaceful." Mrs. McCaskey ignored his rude comment and grabbed his arm. "John," she said softly, "Mrs. Murphy's little boy is lost. This city is such a dangerous place for little boys. Mike is 6 years old. John, that's how old our boy would have been if we had one 6 years ago." "We never had a boy," said Mr. McCaskey, stating the fact plainly. "But if we did, John, think how sad we'd feel tonight if he were lost. If our little Phelan ran away, I'd be heartbroken." "You're talking nonsense," said Mr. McCaskey. "If we had a boy, he'd be named Pat after my father in Cantrim." "That's not true," said Mrs. McCaskey calmly. "My brother was much better than 10 of your McCaskeys. The boy would be named after him." She leaned out the window and looked down at the busy scene below. "John," she said softly, "I'm sorry I got angry at you earlier." "It's fine," said Mr. McCaskey. "You made quick food tonight. Fast pudding, fast turnips, and quick coffee. It was a quick lunch, for sure." Mrs. McCaskey slipped her arm around her husband's and held his rough hand in hers. "Listen to Mrs. Murphy crying," she said. "It's so sad for a little boy to be lost in this big city. If it were our little Phelan, John, I'd be crying just like her." Awkwardly, Mr. McCaskey pulled his hand away. But then he put his arm around his wife's shoulder. "It's silly, of course," he said gruffly, "but I'd feel bad too if our little Pat were taken. I've been harsh with you sometimes, Judy. Forget it, okay?" They sat together at the window, watching the scene below. People crowded the street, asking questions, spreading rumors, and trying to help. Mrs. Murphy kept walking back and forth, crying loudly, her tears flowing like a waterfall. After some time, loud voices and noise came from in front of the house again. "What's happening now, Judy?" asked Mr. McCaskey. "It's Mrs. Murphy," said Mrs. McCaskey, listening. "She says she found little Mike. He was asleep behind some old linoleum under her bed." Mr. McCaskey laughed loudly. "That's your Phelan," he said sarcastically. "No boy named Pat would ever hide under a bed like that." "But a Phelan?" "Yes, he would." Mrs. McCaskey sighed and stood up. She walked toward the dishes, her mouth turning down at the corners. Meanwhile, Policeman Cleary came back to the street corner as the crowd broke up. He tilted his ear toward the McCaskey apartment and heard the sounds of kitchen utensils crashing again. He checked his watch. "By the saints," he said. "John McCaskey and his wife have been fighting for over an hour. She's 40 pounds heavier than him. Good luck to him." Policeman Cleary walked away around the corner. Old Mr. Denny folded his newspaper and went upstairs just as Mrs. Murphy was locking the door for the night.